Hi, my name's Lucy Beard and I'm from Hope Distillery, which is based in Salt River in Cape Town. It's Cape Town's first gin distillery, and we launched back in 2014, which is not all that long ago but feels like a lifetime. We wanted to make gin just because gin was having such a sort of renaissance around the world. It's a truly old spirit. It first sort of came into being as Genever back, in the 1600s. The Dutch were passionate about Genever, which is a slightly different drink to what gin is now. It was basically made from a malt barley base and flavored with juniper. And that is the key thing about gin and is what makes gin gin. And it evolved over time, and when the British fought the Belgians, well, Belgium as a country didn't exist, but it sort of fought the people from that area in the 30 Years' War. The Dutch soldiers went into battle sort of having drunk their little snifter of Genever, and it made them fearsome soldiers. And the British were really taken with this and fell in love with the spirit and basically adopted it and made it their own. And gin was born. And then, gin went through a bit of an up and down over the years. You might have heard of Mother's Ruin, and that was the term that was coined when the price of gin really dropped and suddenly everyone in Britain could afford it. Traditionally, the drink of choice had been ale, and it was mainly a man's drink. And suddenly women were allowed into gin palaces, whereas they weren't allowed into the ale houses. And women's drinking became a thing. And it was of varying quality, and so had rather a bad effect on a lot of people. And it became known as Mother's Ruin because literally women were drinking so much of it and kind of falling about in the street drunk, forgetting to feed their babies. And the infant mortality rate went through the roof. And the British government had to bring in, I think there were 6 different acts to try and regulate the consumption of gin. And so it got a bit of a bad name through that period. And it was actually in the 1980s, so years and years later, that gin became cool again. In the intervening period, there'd been prohibition in the States, and gin was popular then, kind of in the underground speakeasy world. But sort of in the modern cocktail culture, vodka was really king. It was such an easy drink to mix. It could go and be drunk in so many ways. And gin was pretty much forgotten about and kind of regarded as an old lady's tipple. It was something your grandmother drank, and in fact I know the Queen Mother was famous for sort of gin being her favorite drink. And so it was in the 1980s that the creators of Bombay Sapphire decided they needed to do something to knock vodka off its crown, sort of as the crown spirit. And they decided to put their gin in a blue bottle and do a whole marketing campaign. And that was the start of what I now term the gin revolution. A few years later, the distillers up in Scotland who make Hendrick's gin, they decided they should launch a gin. They were a whiskey distillery, and they decided to kind of hark back to the good side of gin. Gin was also regarded as something medicinal because juniper berries and the other botanicals were often used for ailments, particularly stomach ailments. And they put the gin in sort of a pharmaceutical style bottle and kind of had this mad inventor style campaign. And it was then that really sort of people started taking to gin again, and gin cocktails became popular. And then, in the in the 2000s, the craft gin boom started happening. And we were actually living in Europe at the time, went traveling, and just saw gin really booming across the world, in Spain in particular. It was quite incredible. And it sort of really made us think, because wow, everyone thinks gin is just gin, but actually gin starts life as vodka, and then is distilled one more time with botanicals, one of which has to be the juniper berry, and that's what turns it into gin. Some people think that vodka is made from potatoes. Most South Africans seem to think that, I don't know why. But actually vodka can be made from any starch or sugar source. And it's usually made from whatever starch or sugar source is cheapest in that country. So sort of in parts of Northern Europe close to Russia, potatoes were cheap, and so potato vodka became a thing. In much of Russia, it's not actually made from potato, it's made from grain. And here in South Africa, it's made from cane sugar. So the cane sugar stalks, that's why we have our own category of vodka. We're the only country in the world that calls cane a separate category to vodka. Cane is essentially just a vodka. But what is vodka? It's a spirit that's been distilled to a very high strength. So basically much of the flavor has been taken out of it, and then it's been blended down with drinking water. Vodka makers across the world claim all these wonderful waters to make it, that much more palatable. But it is a neutral alcohol. The joy of gin is that you start with that neutral alcohol and you actually flavor it. As I mentioned, the one essential flavorant or botanical is the juniper berry. And it's a small, it's a purple berry, but not actually a berry. The juniper is part of the pine family. And a juniper berry is essentially a cone, but it's a sort of small, it doesn't look anything like a pine cone. It's a small purple cone. And if you crush that juniper berry, there are 3 little kind of seeds within the berry, and they contain this amazing oil. And if you crush it and smell it, it smells like a bottle of London dry gin. And that is what gives gin its unique flavor. But what makes gin so interesting is that it's not just juniper. It can be any number of other botanicals. I keep on going on about botanicals. Botanicals are basically anything that you can use to flavor food is a botanical. So whether it be spices, nuts, herbs, citrus peels, sort of if it adds flavor to food, you can use it to add flavor to gin. And the joy of it is that no 2 gins are the same. So each will have its particular recipe, and each will taste completely different. They're different styles of gin. So the London dry gin was, when I was talking about the British sort of adopting gin as their drink, they adopted the London dry gin, very juniper forward with hints of citrus. But now the gin revolution of modern days has sort of introduced, Hendrick's being the first, introduced weird and wonderful flavors. So Hendrick's was cucumber and rosewater. I mean, who ever thought of putting that into a gin? And here in South Africa, it's so amazing because we've got, the Fynbos floral kingdom, so lots of interesting, unusual ingredients and that are sort of unknown in the rest of the world. So we found that people would actually become gin tourists and seek us out, wanting to try different botanicals and different gins. And it's also been amazing for our business because we not only make gins for ourselves, but we design and develop gins for other people. And the joy of it is that no 2 gins are the same. And so you can have a spicy gin, you can have a floral gin, but within that you can have, very particular flavors. And it is all about, it's almost like being a chef, but not playing with food. It's being a distiller playing with flavor. So it's not just about the science, it's also about the flavoring. Okay. So what is distilling? Distilling is actually really simple. And it's one of the reasons why my husband and I, we came from a completely different background, weren't scientists at all. It's a very simple science. The science behind distilling is that alcohol has a lower boiling point than water. You put water, alcohol, and for gin, all your gin botanicals into basically what is essentially a kettle, heat it up, and the alcohol has a lower boiling point than water, so it will evaporate off first. And you basically separate the alcohol away from the water. The joy of the gin is that actually the botanicals all have oils. The oils are quite volatile and they will evaporate off with the alcohol. And it's the oils of those botanicals that are actually flavoring the gin. So essentially we load the still with high strength vodka, put in some water, put in the particular botanical lineup for the gin in question. You turn the still on, it heats up, eventually boiling point is reached, the alcohol starts evaporating off. You then have to condense that down. Obviously it's in a vapor form, so you cool it down so that it condenses down to liquid form and collect that. It comes off the still, so the kettles are called stills. And the gin comes off the still in the high 80% alcohol, so you certainly don't want to bottle that, but that's beautiful kind of strong gin. And as the gin run sort of continues, so we distill for a number of hours, the botanicals start to almost stew in one sense, because obviously they've been in this hot liquid for a long time, and you have less and less alcohol in the pot, and so more and more volatiles and kind of the nasty things that give you hangovers. And you carry on distilling because you've still got alcohol, but you actually collect that separately, and that's called the tails of the run. What you've collected initially is the hearts, and that is what goes into the bottle. And then what you do is you blend it down to bottling strength. In South Africa, bottling strength is 43%. It's slightly higher than in the rest of the world, and it's a sort of strange sort of leftover from apartheid days, when the apartheid government was wanting to protect the local distilling industry. Sort of the rest of the world, the minimum bottling strength is between about 37.5 and about just 40. South Africa put it up to 43, so that so the big distilling companies at the time, for example, Gordon's Gin, didn't want to make a separate product just for the South African market. So they got the local distilling industry in South Africa to make the South African version of Gordon's. So it gave work to South Africa. But we pay excise duties based on alcohol percentage. So the current government has got no incentive to lower that bottling strength at all, because it would mean less money for them. So we have this sort of weirdly slightly higher than the rest of the world minimum. But I guess also South Africans love their alcohol, and would say that, we're stronger than the rest of the world. And so we blend it down with purified water, and then bottle it. And one of the reasons, the other reasons that sort of craft distilleries have been having such a boom is that, unlike whiskey, gin doesn't have to be aged. So whiskey has to be in a barrel for a minimum number of years, as does brandy. With gin, you basically can distill it and pretty much bottle it straight away. For us, a distilling run, depending on which of our stills we use, but we've got two 400-litre stills, and then Mad Mary, which is an 800-litre still. They actually both take around 16 hours to do a full distillation run, so it's quite a long time. And then we gather the gin and actually like to let it sit in tank for at least a week, just because we think that allows for all the different botanical oils to settle, to marry together, and kind of just fuse and last. And then we blend it with water and bottle it. So in theory, you could have gin within a day, but we like to ensure that it's sort of at least a week, often longer. Ideally 21 days is kind of the period you'd like to wait. And then once it's in the bottle, obviously you want to know how to best drink it. And gin is traditionally always drunk in a gin and tonic format, which really, when you add the tonic, it allows the botanicals oils to really expand and come into their own. And I've also been told, although as I said I'm not a scientist, that for some reason tonic and juniper have a similar chemical makeup, and so they go together brilliantly. I explain it that actually juniper is slightly bittersweet, tonic is also usually bittersweet, and so they are a match made in heaven. And then the other sort of thing that has come with the craft gin revolution is the whole world of garnishes. So everyone wants their gin and tonic to look beautiful, and sometimes you get sort of fruit salads of gin and tonics, which is not something I'm such a fan of. But it's really amazing to play with different garnishes, because they can either highlight the botanicals of the gin or complement them, and so really enhance your drinking experience. So let's go and take a look at what we can do. So as I said, the most important thing for most of you is how to drink your gin. The whole kind of craft revolution has turned the gin and tonic from just something with a slice of lemon, served with Schweppes tonic, which was the only one available, into this whole kind of world of possibilities. And I mentioned, we were in Spain when we really sort of decided to go on this journey, and I remember walking into a bar, and it was a tiny little bar in a village, and I said to Lee, it looks as though this might be a gin bar. There were several gins lined up on the shelf, and we asked the barman for a gin and tonic, and he looked at us with a confused look on his face, and I was like, maybe it's not a gin and tonic bar. And he was like, no, which gin do you want? Which tonic? How would you like it served? And we just started to realize, wow, there was this, sort of whole way of drinking gin that we didn't know anything about. And it's quite incredible, we realize, having developed the gins, each of them has their unique botanicals, and each are either complemented or highlighted by different tonics and by different garnishes. There is no right or wrong. The joy of it is to play around and work out what you love best. In terms of tonic, often we get asked, how important is the tonic? In a gin and tonic, most of what's in your glass is tonic. The gin is a single or double shot and the rest of the glass is tonic, so it's important. The joy is we now have quite a few different local tonics available. My two favorites are the Fitch and Leeds and Barker and Quinn. I'm very much a classic girl. I like an Indian tonic, which is basically citrus with the hints of bitterness that is tonic. Actually is called tonic because it was first used by the British when they were in India way back in the colonial days. Malaria was rife, and it was found that quinine was a good medicine for preventing malaria, and it was served to the British soldiers in the form of a tonic, which was essentially sparkling water, quinine, which was very bitter, and lemon, partly to give the soldiers some citrus elements to prevent scurvy, partly just to disguise the nasty bitterness of the quinine. But the British soldiers, of course, immediately realized that tonic was far better served with gin, and the gin and tonic was really born. Tonic still has quinine in it, although in quantities that are not quite enough to prevent malaria. But it has that beautiful sort of bittersweet edge to it. Classic Indian tonic I love because it really allows the botanicals of the gin to shine. It doesn't give too much other flavor. But lemon, and the reason why gin and tonic was traditionally always served with a slice of lemon lifts flavors. So it really allows the botanicals in the gin to sing. The light tonic from Barker and Quinn is delicious if you're looking for a low sugar option. And then if you are wanting a colored gin, because I know sort of pinks, blues and all the rest of it, all the rage, I would recommend the grapefruit tonic from Fitch and Leeds. That actually goes incredibly well with our African botanical gin. Just the sort of bitterness of the grapefruit lends itself with the fruitiness of the fynbos that's in our African botanical gin. But yeah, as I said, you can play around and see what works for you. I also don't recommend you drowning your gin and tonic. You want to taste the gin. So sort of I suggest sort of 50 mils of gin to 100 mils of tonic. Some would find that very strong, but you do rather drink it slower, and really that allows you to taste the gin. And then in terms of garnishes are, I always say gin has sort of two botanical elements. It's got the botanicals that actually go into making the gin, and then afterwards what you put in your glass, and that, as I said before, either enhances or complements. I sometimes blame Hendrick's for introducing the cucumber to gin. Hendrick's is an amazing gin, distilled, and sort of afterwards a cucumber essence is added together with rose water, and their recommended garnish is cucumber, which is heavenly, except that people then want to add cucumber to every gin out there, not realizing that cucumber is actually a really strong flavor. And so for a more delicate gin, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. It goes beautifully with our London Dry, which is our classic gin. But our African botanical and Mediterranean gins, you rather want to explore the flavors that the gins have to offer. And so I recommend sort of herbs of some sort, rosemary and thyme being my preferred, but there actually are rosemary and thyme in those gins. And then citrus is always sort of a wonderful go-to garnish. Grapefruit if you want a little bit of fruitiness and bitterness. Lime has an incredible sweetness as well as the sort of more lemon characters. And then lemon, I would say if you're using lemon, I would recommend actually just using the rind. So getting a potato peeler and doing a zest of because it's the skin of the lemon that has all the beautiful bright lemon oils, and that's what you want in your drink. It really lifts any drink. And I sort of say, everyone sort of says, oh, how do I know what best goes with what? if you've only got a lemon, it's sort of a match made in heaven for any gin, but I would always recommend just the skin. But ultimately, you know, the joy of it is that you can try all sorts of different combinations and decide what works best for you and how you enjoy your gin. So, and then in terms of ice, you want your gin and tonic to be as cold as possible. So tonic is great, but once it starts to warm up, it can get slightly sickly. The thing about ice as well is you don't want it to melt too much because that dilutes your gin. So either use big blocks of ice, and I know sort of people have started buying the big gin balloon goblets, and you know, yes, they fit a lot of gin in, but actually they allow, you know, a big ice cube, those beautiful, either the rounds or the big squares, and that actually sits and doesn't dilute your drink but keeps it ice cold. If you've just got normal ice, I recommend lots of it, because the more ice you have, the less it melts, because the colder the drink stays and the less dilution you get. And then just in terms of gin botanicals, you know, I have mentioned a little bit juniper, of course, being the key botanical. Without juniper, you cannot call a gin gin. It's simply a flavored vodka. But there are actually 3 key gin botanicals, and these are in all of the gins we make and most of the gins in the world. So juniper being the key, but the second one is coriander seed. And not many people know that. I mean, in South Africa, I think it's more known as a biltong spice than anything else. But coriander is amazing. We use the seed, and it's got a lemon oil in it. It's called linalool, and it adds a real citrus note to a gin. But it's also really good at giving body to a spirit and kind of disguising the alcohol kind of burn or kick. So it's very important in a gin. And then the third botanical that's really key is something called angelica root. And then, yeah, so angelica root, it's the root of a Belgian herb. It has a sort of mushroomy, mulchy, forest floor taste. So it gives a base note to a gin, but also is an incredibly important botanical because it marries the other botanicals together. It's almost called a fixer. In perfume, you have something which is orris root, which is used in a lot of perfumes. It's very expensive. We do use it in some gin, but because it's so expensive, angelica root tends to be what gin distillers use. And then after that, the world's your oyster. Our London Dry, as I said, a London Dry is a traditional juniper forward gin. Juniper forward meaning that juniper is the dominant flavor profile. We also, so it's got the juniper, the coriander seed, and the angelica root. And then we also use lemon peel and orange peel. They're sun-dried peels we get from the Cedarburg. And then we use lemon pelargonium, which is a native, some people think it's a geranium, but the British mistakenly called it a geranium. The pelargonium is an indigenous plant, and the lemon one has these amazingly bright smelling lemon leaves. So we use the leaves, which give a sort of bright citrus note. And then rosemary. Then our African botanical gin is similar to the London Dry. It only differs in 2 botanicals, but this kind of demonstrates how different gins can be by just those small tweaks. Unlike wine, where you're relying on terroir, you know, sort of a grape variety will taste sort of in keeping, but it often takes a real wine aficionado to kind of say, oh yes, I know that this is from, you know, a south-facing slope, etc. We are physically putting the flavors into the gin, so you can taste the differences. And the African botanical has something called kapokbos, which is a wild sweet rosemary. It's quite it's sort of fragrant and aromatic, and yet it's quite astringent, so it gives the gin a bit of a dry finish. And then we use buchu. Buchu was traditionally used in brandy. It's been used for medicinal purposes for years and years. We use a variety that has quite a black currant flavor, so it gives the gin a lovely fruitiness. And as I said, that goes really well with the grapefruit tonic. It goes well with a slice of grapefruit as a garnish. But it's sort of the ideal gin and tonic on a hot summer's day gin, because once the tonic is added, the buchu and the kapokbos really open up and kind of, yeah, almost sing out of the glass. So I always describe that one as the Western Cape in a glass. And then the Mediterranean is our most left field gin, if you were. It's our most unusual, and as I said, we were inspired to start making gin when we were in the Mediterranean, and it was in Spain that we kind of saw the variety of gins available. And so this is completely different to the other two. It's distilled with olives and herbs. So green manzanilla olives that we get from near Stellenbosch, and then basil, rosemary, thyme, lemon thyme, bay leaves to give it a bit of savouriness, and then cardamom to give it, also sort of a savoury top note. Far more complex. It's fantastic with food because it's got all those flavours that you traditionally cook with. And it's amazing. It can be garnished in so many ways. It's also got lots of orange peel in it. So it's great with a slice of orange. It's great with a big sprig of basil, which really lifts the basil. If you love olives, you can actually kind of increase the oliveness by adding an olive and a dash of the olive brine. We've had it even served with olive oil on it, and you get that amazing olive nose. Or just with rosemary, lemon peel, it kind of sings on so many levels. But the three in our range really demonstrate just how different gins can be, and that's all the botanicals at play.